like I say, some of those connect and some of them don't connect. And the jury's out for you on which one that was. I would like to, as always, invite our time by inviting you to share thoughts or questions or even just reactions, knowing that we did read 2 sections, right? And if you didn't make it all, that's fine. Just let's talk about what you were able to read, or even memories you have of either the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, or the initial patterns that the 2 boys put together with their uncle. So I'm going to invite Herb, if you're willing to share first.
Yeah, I think these were stories about deceit among family members, which was kind of disheartening. You know, Isaac stealing his brother's birthright a couple of times, you know, or blessings and birthright, and then being deceived by his uncle Laban about marriage to his daughters, and then that continued into 2 Samuel, where one brother kills another and then deceives his father into trying to take over the country. So, but these stories probably aren't too dissimilar to what goes on today. Who thinks that it's different, but probably it's not. So, so I'm going to call on Jane Flynn.
Well, every time I have ever heard or read the story of Abraham and his son, I can't, I don't have that kind of faith. I wouldn't have done it. I try to picture myself taking my only son and killing him because God told me to. I couldn't do that. I don't have faith strong enough for that, to think that he will provide a substitute or he will stop me or whatever. I wouldn't have even started the journey. I would have said, how can you even ask this?
Thank you. Jane, would you like to invite somebody else?
I will invite Ellen.
Sorry, I dropped in late. I have an interesting office today.
We're glad you're here.
I echo what James said. I would gladly give my own life for my child or my family members, but I could never take the life of a loved one. I don't understand this story. I think there are other ways to prove faithfulness. You know, I don't get this story at all. So, Mike, maybe you have some enlightening words about that. And Herb, you're so right. All families have these things going on, and there have been times when I would have said, I am going to kill you for what you're doing, but not really. So maybe that's God. I don't know. Anyway, I'm rambling. Lila, what do you have to say today?
Hi there, Ellen, and thank you. And yeah, I don't like this story one little bit, and have a lot of trouble with how it portrays God as the God that requires us to merit his good grace. We have to prove ourselves. It's so what I'm hoping Mike can help us do is go back to what it meant in the culture when it was written, for looking for meaning within that culture. And so taking it at face value, the text says it was a test for Abraham. So Abraham I don't think shows much initiative. When Sarah tells him they need to get rid of Hagar, and he does, and she tells him he needs to go into Hagar, and he does, and then God tells him to do this. I don't know. Yeah. He's not a very satisfying patriarch for me at this moment. So I cannot connect with this in terms of faith in this tester God or obedience to this tester God's will. And obedience is so countercultural to us anyway. It's hard without anything else. So I usually sit on the idea that this was to distinguish this Hebrew sect from the surrounding cults that did sacrifice their children. That's all I can figure. And I was really interested actually in why Sarah's death and burial, why was that made such a big deal of? And why was it a big deal that Abraham would buy that land? And then Rebecca and Sarah, first they have names, and we don't always get women's names in the scriptures. And Rebecca even has some agency in accepting the marriage. She can choose, right? So women were respected here more than later. So that's a question in my mind. So I have more questions than conclusions as usual. And I would like to invite Meg.
Thank you. I think that maybe this story about Abraham and Isaac has a broader meaning than what we are perceiving. In other words, we're reading the story and we're seeing the facts of the story, but what is the real message of the story? For example, as you pointed out, Lila, Abraham was a very ordinary human being. He's just like us in many, many ways. Then also, this story is about trust. In other words, it's about listening to God and trusting God. Now, God has never asked anybody else that we know of to sacrifice any child or anything. Some misguided individuals may have done that, but anyway, the thing is this. So God has not tested us that way, perhaps. But what does this story mean for us? Well, to me, what it has a broader meaning. In other words, if we really totally trust God, God will always be there for us. And this applies to ordinary human life. In other words, it's like we have problems or situations, and we don't really know how to work them out exactly. But for the people who truly trust and rely on God, they'll talk to God about that and say, now, dear God, I've done everything I know I can do, so I leave it in your hands. Your will be done. Please guide me. So the main point here is that for a person or people to stay lovingly faithful to God, God will always be lovingly faithful to them. And I think the story of Abraham and Isaac exemplifies that point.
Meg, will you call on the next person to share? Please?
Tim.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple observations. Yeah, in this story, Abraham does not know it's a test. You and I know it's a test, but Abraham doesn't know it's a test. And I think that's important. And child sacrifice was something that was very common in that time among the Canaanites. And but we get a little hint though that perhaps Isaac isn't going to be sacrificed, because Isaac is one of the few people that doesn't get his name changed. He keeps his name throughout the whole story of Isaac. And I think that's kind of interesting. The other thing that I find interesting, kind of stepping back a little bit, is when Abraham reveals that he and his wife are brother and sister. That's something that we don't know about, but that they know about. And I think this kind of makes the story a little interesting. But I don't, I see Abraham as just following what God has told him to do, which was a tradition, maybe not in their society, but in the society as a whole. So I'll call on John.
I can't say that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this story, because I think this discussion has caused me to think a little bit more about it. I wonder, I know that I would have pushed back had God said, asked me to take the life of one of my children to prove my belief in God. But it is, I don't find it difficult. And I guess one of the things I question or I wonder is Abraham pushed back more than once. He didn't this time. I wonder why. So I'm going to pass it on to Kay.
I'm going to go back to a different story, the story of Rebecca, because I got a lot out of our readings this week, but I've always questioned Rebecca and her tricking of Isaac. And then I read the line or the verse in the Bible that said that the elders shall serve the younger. So even before they were born, God told her that it would be Jacob that was the one who would get the blessing. And I sort of delved into that a little bit. I found that an interesting discovery for me. And then I also found it interesting that Jacob, when he named the city, after he laid his head on the stone and named the city Bethel, he named it after a Canaanite deity, which I found interesting. So I will pass it on to who hasn't gone yet. Mike, can you help me? Who hasn't gone yet?
Graciela, Amber, and Mary.
Amber, I'll choose you.
This story has always been really hard for me, and I guess reading it now, it just kind of made me laugh because I really, instead of taking in the deep brutality of the story, I kind of just saw it as a cautionary tale against fanaticism. Fanaticism will always lead you to betray your own foundational, fundamental beliefs by demanding you to set aside your critical thinking, which is one of your greatest gifts from God. And, the speaker in the video said that this was God learning something. But, God's supposed to know everything. I mean, now God knows something is kind of ludicrous to me. I don't really understand that comment. If he already knows, he isn't learning anything. So, and the idea that Abraham is proving his faithfulness, but yet he doesn't push back against anything, it seems more like the story is showing how God is proving something to Satan. Satan kind of teases him and says, hey, your follower is not totally faithful. And God says, oh, yes, he is. And then goes about setting up a circumstance to prove that to Satan. It's weird to me because, later in the Bible, it talks about how you shouldn't test God, but Satan can, and then God will play along with that. I don't understand that. That seems very illogical and contradictory to me. And I wondered if the reason why Abe doesn't push back in this particular story is because it's not about Abe proving anything. It's about God proving something. And when God has something to prove, it all works out. So I don't know. That's, yeah. And Mary.
Oh, sorry. Hi. I don't know what I want to say. I think just some comments, just commenting on somebody said something about how this is just the people of God, like when they were telling the story, it's like the people of God creating their identity with God and understanding what that identity looked like. And so, yes, I thought of the difference between those who are sacrificing children versus this people is saying, no, we're not going to be about human sacrifice. We don't believe that's what God requires of us. And then, you know, I think the idea always, like a theme that I always see throughout the Bible, and I see it here too, is just this idea of God as rescuer, you know, and so in the last minute, he provides another sacrifice, you know, and just it's an example of him rescuing. And I have to admit to not reading everything, but yes, like this, you know, in Genesis where we see like the younger being favored, and as the oldest in my family, like I've always been like, why is the youngest always favored and selected by God? Like, what's wrong with me, the oldest, you know? But, and I know, like, Mike, you asked us not to read any commentary, but I had read commentary going into this, you know, but just that idea of like, you know, the nation, the Hebrew nation being like the youngest, not one of the big countries around it, you know, and so it's identifying in these stories with the younger brother being favored by God. So those are two thoughts.
Thanks, Mary. I didn't see Graciela, so maybe when she comes back, I can invite her. You know, I want to say up front that by all means, read a commentary if it's helpful, but do your own thinking first. That's really the goal, is don't use the commentary to like short circuit like the issues the text brings up with you. Sometimes commentaries are really helpful in giving you different views, as long as you know it's just an idea. It's not the norm. It's not a normative read, right? And so if we read a study note and we're like, oh, that's what it must mean, I want to caution you against that, right? And if we use the notes to like, again, to like play shoots and ladders with like our own struggle, I just think it's a mistake. So hopefully that makes sense. So there's a couple of questions I have in the chat, and you know, like I think this is really robust, and it's helpful to hear that our Jewish brothers and sisters didn't call this the sacrifice of Isaac. They call it the Akedah, which means binding, because the normative read is that Isaac is not sacrificed. Although, if you listen to Rabbi Gary Rendsburg, it might be interesting for you to know there are some rabbis who say Abraham does the deed, because a careful read of the text is both of them go up and Abraham, according to the text, comes down by himself. So some rabbis say Abraham did in fact slay his son, and that God resuscitates Isaac. Now you might be saying, hey, the story resists that. But again, the rabbis read 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. That's how they read the story, as this possibility. But in general, the normative read is Yitzhak is not sacrificed. It may be interesting for you to hear that in Midrash that Isaac is 38. Now, normally we think of him as a boy, but the Midrash says he's 38. And I remember asking my Orthodox brother, like, boy, this seems like a really tough way to meet God, like really tough way. Like what happens? And he's like, well, you read the Midrash, and Yitzhak goes back to Eden after this and studies the Torah for like 7 years. No, that's weird, because there's like an angel and a flaming sword. But I just want you to hear, like, there's all of this different, like, mythology is not meant to be a derogatory term, but there's a lot of tradition around this, or mythology, that like you probably haven't heard before. The age of Yitzhak, he goes to Eden. It's possible Abraham slays the kid. Like, I don't think probably most of you have heard those ideas, and that those circulate around in Hebrew traditions. That's what part of why I want to share them with you. Another thing that the rabbis pick up is that God has to answer. God does this really weird thing. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac. And the rabbis pay really careful attention to this. And they're like, why so many qualifiers? And the rabbis say, because Abraham was thinking of Ishmael. Take your son, your only son, the one you love. All of that could be Ishmael, until God says Isaac. That's a really interesting read, that maybe Abraham actually himself prefers Ishmael, but it's Sarai that pushes Yitzhak. I want to suggest that there's a couple of ways to hear this. And people asked about the Canaanite tradition. So look, it's all over the place. To be honest with you, there's a pantheon of gods, and we all get that. There's gods like El, and El and Baal are sky gods, and sky gods are worshipped in high places. So the higher you get, the closer you get to the sky god, right? I mean, this is like how shrines are made. And when Moshe goes up on top of the mountain, right, there's like a cloud that comes from the sky, and that's clear. Moshe's gone up to the high place and is meeting the sky god, right? But in other traditions, and certainly in Canaanite tradition too, there's these gods of the earth. And so if you go up to worship the sky god, but you go down to worship the earth god. So in general, when you worship the earth gods, you look for the relative minimum, not the maximum. And it turns out that the relative minimum for the earth god is in this little valley outside Jerusalem. It's called the Hinnom Valley. In Greek, this is called Gehenna. This is the word that shows up in our Bible that interpreters render into the word hell. But it really means the Valley of Hinnom. Herb Meyer and Ellen Maston and John Leedy went to hell with me about 5 years ago. Like, we stood in hell. By the way, there's a lovely church there. Hell is actually a really physical place on the planet. It's the relative minimum outside of Jerusalem. And it was the place where earth gods, and there's different names for them in the Bible. You'll see them. Chemosh, Milcom, Molech are these like different names in Semitic languages for this earth god. And the way gods of the earth were worshipped apparently was in this low place, and you did the divine like the highest barter. You sacrificed your most valuable possession to obligate the god to pay you back. And the most valuable thing you had, and children were commodities, was your firstborn child, because that was your heritage and your legacy all bound up in one thing, right? You might not get another one of those. So Solomon does it. Solomon kills one of his firstborn children. You'll read that in Kings. The wicked king Manasseh does it, slays his firstborn son in hell. And it's interesting to think that theologically, hell is a place where we sacrifice a living being to please or barter with God. I'd like you to really think on that. What's interesting in the story is that Abraham doesn't just prepare to kill Isaac, he prepares to sacrifice laughter itself. Because that's what Isaac means. And I think it's a really interesting thing, like Amber talked about fanaticism. If God is asking us to sacrifice our joy, that might actually be hell and not God. the rabbis take Abraham to task on this. They say, look, this guy argued on behalf of people in Sodom, who, by the way, were clearly like not righteous people. So he didn't have a word to say to God about his own son. And I hope it's helpful to hear that. In Sunday school, I was taught when God tells you to do something, you do it. But essentially what the rabbis say is, hey, God tests Abraham's faith and Abraham fails. He does not pass the test, he fails. Now, I don't want to take away any positive meaning you get from the story, because I think you can do that. To me, as a parent with children, my answer is hell no. Because if I say hell yes, I'll be living in hell, literally and figuratively. And I think there's a really interesting thing that we as human beings don't do very well culturally. And I want to draw it out. Listening does not mean obeying. Many times when I talk to somebody about something that's important to them, the expectation is if I really listen, I will obey. And I'm going to disagree with that. And I invite you to contemplate the difference between listening, hearing the words, hearing, or maybe I should say hearing is just processing the sounds. Listening is hearing under the sounds, and then obedience, because they're not all the same thing. I can listen to your concern empathetically and not obey you. And maybe faithfulness actually is not confusing listening with obedience sometimes. Now, I have to tell you, I'm prejudiced. I don't like the story. I don't like it. And I would say this is a marker culturally that Hebrew people are not called to do like the other people. Now, some people say, look, the test here is, hey, Abraham, the people around you are showing their fidelity to God by sacrificing the most valuable thing. So the question is, do you love God as much as these Canaanites show obedience to your gods? Okay, maybe, but then I think the interpretive move here is, don't do this. Don't do this. And what's interesting to hear, right, is that the word angel in Hebrew really means messenger. So this could be a winged thing, but probably not. This could be another human being saying, Abraham, stop it. And I'd like you to invite yourself to consider we're called to be angelic messengers. And when people are prepared to sacrifice their joy to show obedience to God, or sacrifice another human being at God's request, we can be divine messengers when we say, stop it.
Can I ask a question?
Always.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see myself if I'm on or not. This might be a hard no, but is, studying alongside my daughter, some different mythology, like in school, and realizing like, oh, there's these ancient stories and they exist within different people groups. Is there a story like this among other groups?
Well, that's a great question. So, of course, this is a fundamental story in Islam, but as you probably know, it's not Yitzhak, it's Ishmael, but Ibrahim is called the offer. So our Muslim brothers and sisters hear this story actually like the Jewish commentators do, where Abraham is thinking this is about Ishmael. Right. By the way, if you want to know, this is a core story. The binding happens on Mount Moriah, which is like the holy place in Jerusalem. Our Islamic brothers and sisters believe it happened on a particular rock that then Abraham drug down to Mecca. And that rock is a meteorite. It's black. It's called the Kaaba. Right. And it's the holiest place that there is. So this is where those traditions share. They differentiate between which kid it is, but they share where and the place. Actually, there's a tradition. if you know anything about Hinduism, there's like 3 principal deities that are expressions of the one deity, and one of them is Shiva. Shiva is the sustainer and the destroyer. And Shiva has a kid and has a fit one time and cuts his head off. And that's what you do when you get all mad. You do things you regret. And so Shiva has to find a new head for his son, and he will take it from the next living thing, which happens to be an elephant. And this is where the god Ganesha comes from. The elephant-headed god is the actual son of a god with an elephant head. So Shiva is able to like kind of resuscitate Ganesha by giving him an elephant head. Of course, in Buddhism, like true Buddhism, there's no gods, there's none gods. So, but and essentially, Siddhartha Gautama does walk away from his wife and child, like he just leaves them. So he leaves them sort of orphaned. We don't know how it works out for them in the end, because they're relatively rich. Maybe that's okay. You know, in like Norse mythology, Balder gets killed by Loki, right? Freya throws like this thing. So there's like these death of these gods. And if you want to read more culturally, I can recommend to you this book. I think I have it on my shelf by Renee Girard called The Scapegoat, in which divine violence is somehow used to solve divine violence. And this shows up in some Peruvian myths as well. My takeaway is that like this is a cautionary tale. Again, I can only say what it means to me. So I don't want to like normalize this too much, but I think we do ourselves a really big disservice as Christian folks when we say like, oh, this is like Jesus. But please notice this is not like Jesus. Jesus actually dies and Isaac might not, right? Isaac has no choice whatsoever in the matter. Well, unless he's 38. But you know, in the text, there's no conversation like, hey, son, God wants me to kill you. And I think we should do that. You know, like that doesn't happen. Whereas Jesus actually like has to come to terms with what he perceives to be like his imminent doom in the Garden of Gethsemane. So there's not that, right? There's not that. There's no lamb takes Jesus's place. Like, let's be honest, right? You like the Lord dies. And I think it's going to sound really nuts. Sometimes we read this story and we normalize it and say, it had to be. But I would invite you to consider, what would have happened if we hadn't killed the Lord? What if we'd said, hey, Jesus, instead of killing you, like, we'd like to keep you around and learn some more from you. Now, I have folks in the church who say, well, then we'd all go to hell. But I want to suggest to you, when we normalize human sacrifice, that's when we go to hell. That's when we go to the low point on the earth's surface, the Valley of Hinnom, and that's hell.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
But, you know, if we view this as the culmination of Abraham's spiritual journey,
yeah,
I'm not sure.
Well, I've got a great phrase for that. I've got a great phrase, and it comes right out of the text. And Lila actually asked it to me in an email, which I think is really, really appropriate. And you may not like it, but the phrase is, now I know you fear God. Yeah. Now I know you fear God. And Lila asked me, is that the same thing as reverence? And I want to say like it could be, because in the sense like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. But I'd like to suggest to you in the story, maybe Abraham is afraid of God. And when you're afraid of God, you will be willing to kill joy in your life. And you will be willing to kill other people to assuage an angry God that you're afraid of. And as I read 1 John, perfect love drives out all fear. So it seems to me like God would prefer we not be afraid of God so that we don't commit atrocities.
But is that how Abraham saw it?
I don't know. That guy's dead. And we don't get any inner monologue. I mean, Abraham's a really interesting character, right? Because you don't really ever get any interior monologue. Our Jewish brothers and sisters are like, why did God have to tell Abraham 3 times, your son, the one you love, Isaac, right? Like why'd that have to happen? Because Abraham doesn't really say, like, here's what I'm thinking about this, you know? So like everything we put into Abraham's mouth is projection. It's clear that some people find the read beneficial, and I'm always glad when people do. I'm probably not mature enough to do that. I find this a very negative story and one that we're asked to resist. I have to be honest, I do, but that's just my own viewpoint, right? So again, like our tradition has said, trust God and God will take care of you. I haven't found that to be the case in my life, that blind trust results in like what I would consider favor. I haven't found that to be the case.
Well, it could be a positive story in that the story is just illustrating how strong Abraham's faith is. And it's an example of how deep we may be asked and how strong is our faith and what's expected of us. Rather than just looking at it as a sacrifice, sacrificing your son, just as a story about what's expected of us.
I think it's really fair, Herb, that like if we do a little bit of nuancing, we can take the concept, because you're going to hear on Sunday, right? If anybody wants to follow me, take up your cross, right? And that, but I do think the difference between that is like something I do for myself, like it's a choice I make and a choice I push onto somebody else. So maybe that's just helpful to hold up. But I do think like the kernel you're saying, right, is that like there are often times when faithfulness means giving something up. I do think that's true. John?
Mike, when was this written?
Don't know.
We don't have an idea as to about when it was written. And I asked it because that may help explain why it was written anyway. Because as you said, and as you know from reading the source, I don't know how far away in terms of years or even hundreds of years this was from sacrificing children to Baal, or I maybe not be pronouncing it right, but anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, so the clue is that you do not, I'm gonna put this in the chat, the oldest sources have God referred to as Lord in all caps, right? That's God's name that woman on the video kept saying. I believe that's flagrantly disrespectful. And like, I would strongly discourage you from trying to intone God's personal name, because that's been considered blasphemy for a long, long time. It's also disrespectful to our Jewish brothers and sisters who would never say that name. Like, even if they're only culturally Jewish, right? Even if they don't believe in God, they don't say that word. So I just would caution you from saying that word. It doesn't show up in Genesis 22, which classic biblical exegetes would tell you this story comes from later, like from 600, 500. When you see the Lord all in caps, that tells you it's an old story, like predates 922. 922 is the year Solomon dies and the kingdom splits up, right?
That's 922 BCE, right?
Correct, yeah. Now, you'll see that word, the Lord, in caps, functions a little bit after Solomon, but after the Babylonian exile, for sure, it's gone. And it's important to hear, like, Jesus probably didn't ever say that word. I know you're thinking, hey, in the Gospel of John, he does. Well, John has him say that for a theological reason, but probably not for a historical reason. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying.
Mike, please say the word so I'll know what word.
No, I'm not going to say it. I refuse to.
Can you give me a hint?
Yeah, it starts with the letter Y.
Okay.
But then I'll tell you, it's completely wrong. The history of the word, right, is that this is where the word Jehovah comes from.
Mhm.
And Jehovah is a made-up word. Jewish scholars made it up so we wouldn't say God's name in ignorance and defile ourselves.
So it's okay to say Jehovah.
Absolutely. The Jewish scholars are hoping we'll say that so that we don't do something dumb. There's some interesting bits about this, right? Like I mentioned to you, and we'll hear it in Moses, but I'll say it again. When Moses gets up on the mountain, he said, God, what's your name? And God responds in first person plural, first person singular, I am who I am, I am. In Hebrew, that sounds like Ehva. But then Moses goes and says God's name is the Y word, which actually means he is who he is.
But Mike, aren't we saying the Y word with every breath?
That's rabbinic commentary, is that God's name is light like a breath, and that it's what animates the first human being. This is the first thing you say when you're born and the last thing you say before you die. And when God's name leaves you, you return to the soil. That's really lovely. That's like in the Quran, when God is closer to you than your jugular vein and reminds you, right, that like your spirit does not live in your heart, it lives right here. Because it's God's breath that keeps you alive. I mean, that's beautiful stuff to me. That's like beautiful theology. It's wonderful connection. But the rabbis are still really clear. Like, you can say that to stay alive, but don't go around saying that. In fact, if you're Jewish, maybe you've seen this before. Jewish people don't write the word God. They write it like so. And you'll notice there's an asterisk where we would normally put the O. And the idea is, in Hebrew, there's no vowels written, there's only consonants. And the word Jehovah comes from the consonants of God's name, but the vowels from the word Adonai, which means plantation holder. And so this is how our Jewish brothers and sisters write God's name. I do want to suggest to you, it's a really interesting story to think about bargaining with God. And I do think there's something very primal culturally that we need to bargain with God. And I want to suggest to you, like, a lot of the faith I was grown into was about bargaining with God. But to be honest, I think I'm trying to grow out of that, because I don't think faith is really meant to be a spiritual barter. I think God is more interested in giving us stuff than getting stuff out of us. And at my best, I give stuff. I don't try to get stuff out of people. I try to give them. And so, like, I think it's very natural to say, like, hey, God, get me out of this speeding ticket and I'll give more money to church. But that kind of transactional faith is not about gifts at all. And it might lead us to be afraid of God, that if we don't do X or Y deeply enough, then we'll pay consequences for it. And I've raised my children that way some, but I also hope my children know that at the end of the day, I'm going to show up no matter what. And if I am a human being and can do that, surely God can do that. I don't know if that makes sense. I say that because the scriptures say that. If you human beings who are steeped in your own pettiness know how to give your children good gifts, how much more does God know how to be the giver? But I think we often project that God is very tit for tat, balancing scales for us all the time, naughty, nice list. But I just think that's us at our worst, not at our best. And if God's better than our best, anyway. I don't know if you'll notice this, but Isaac didn't have much to say in the Bible. And if you met God at the end of a knife point, you might not have much to say either. I mean, you talk about the definition of PTSD. Here's son, let's go worship the God. Now, this won't hurt you very much. I mean, sorry, this won't hurt me very much. Yeah. Lila, you'd asked this question about Sarah and the land, and I think what's interesting to think, right, at the end of Abraham's life, all he's got is a cemetery. He's got a place to bury his dead. He's not like taken any possession of this land. And this is true today. Like, you can go to Hebron and visit this site. You can go. You probably need to be in a bulletproof bus, according to our Israeli bus driver Yuval, because this is in the middle of like the West Bank, right? This is in Palestinian territory. And because of a history of abuse, Western tourists are not like extremely welcome. Actually, in the shrine, there's a Jewish entrance and there's a Muslim entrance.
Hey,
So the-
hey, oh,
Yeah, Tim.
oh, but isn't the whole story about him actually owning the land?
Yeah, he's like his foothold. At the end of the day, he gets one piece.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting bit to think about how like promises aren't accomplished immediately. They take years and years and years and years and years and years, right? And so, like, again, at the end of the day, Abraham doesn't even buy a field, he buys a cave.
Why was that so important to him? I mean, if you put all of his wealth into that cave, why was that so important that he have a grave for her? Or was he really buying a grave for himself?
It's probably both. And I think like at the end of the day, you know, this story, you know, it comes up, and this is still true of Zionism, like who has the original land rights? And it's the tough bit, right? And here's a story about somebody who's got some claim to some land, right? It's like the transaction's been enacted and land passes down generationally, even more so then than now, even more so then, right? Because every 50 years, you're supposed to restore land. That's the Jubilee. So here's like a finalized transaction that at least this part, Machpelah, should belong to Abraham's people.
And they come back to it, right? They come back to it at the end.
Yeah, they do. They come back. Yeah. It's interesting to think you don't hear anything from Ishmael, but you don't hear a word from him that he and Isaac go bury their dad together. I find that very interesting. Ishmael gets cut out of the whole story. He inherits nothing, but he does come back to bury his father. I mean, that's interesting to me. Do you notice that this weird bit, right? Like we pinky swear, but you notice that the servant is swearing on Abraham's genitals. This is the root of our word testament, testify, testimony. I'm glad we've moved away from that.
So my,
At the time of Abraham, though, and you can read this in the red tent, this transition that happens, right? It's sort of thought that like little people lived inside the man and the woman was just a passive vessel to grow the little people, right? And so this is like that idea is that life comes from the man, not from the woman. It's weird how that's like gone back and forth according to anthropologists as to like where life comes from. But at this point in the narrative, that's why you swear on the source of life, which is the testicles. Yeah, again, we just thank God that culture changes sometimes. You notice that the servant says, "Hey, God of my master." It's really clear that Abraham's servant does not worship God, but is appealing to Abraham's God. I don't know if you noticed in the Bethel story, Jacob's not in the middle of the desert. He goes to a pagan shrine. He goes to a high place or a low place. And then he has this dream of God and he says, "Oh, I didn't know you lived here too. I thought you only lived back there at that place I lived." And it gives you this really good idea of the polytheism of the day, was the belief that gods had territories. The gods of Egypt lived in Egypt and they didn't make it across. Like that was their domain. And here Jacob is having this experience that like, oh, like God's territory is bigger than I thought it were.
Mike, maybe change the subject a little bit, but there are several times throughout these stories where God discusses the covenant that he provides Abraham and the Israeli people. But it always sounds a little different every time he says it.
Yeah.
Initially, he talked about you'll have the land from, I think, Tigris Euphrates to the Wadi in Egypt. And then later he tells Abraham, go to the land of Canaan, if you will. And that sounds like that's the covenant. And what's the view on whether the covenant has ever been realized?
It's a great question. I think it probably depends from interpreter to interpreter. And I think particularly if you're a Zionist, you're trying to say look, we're called to live into this thing. And that's why that land's so important. Because it's a very specific promise. It's not you'll have a land, you'll have this land.
Yes.
And then the boundaries do stretch according to the story, right? And something that we don't realize, actually, most of us don't realize, is that the largest territory was not under the King David. It was under King Omri, who's this wicked king in the north. He grew the 10 tribes, the northern 10 tribes, into the biggest land grab that they've ever had. So there's this idea that it was bigger under David, but it's not. It's bigger under this bad guy. So then the question is what are the boundaries? And Zionists continue to ask this question. What's rightfully ours? And you see, this is what undergirds a lot of the Palestinian tension and Zionist settlers. I don't want to talk about what's right and wrong. I want to say descriptively, they believe this land belongs to them.
Yes.
And it's helpful to have some empathy. You can say that's silly, but this is their underlying cultural story. It's this land. It must be here. And many of us don't realize, if you're Orthodox and you get buried, you either want to ship you can't really ship your body because you have to be buried within 24 hours. What our Orthodox brothers and sisters do in this country is they brought soil with them from the land. And they use that soil at their burial here. That may seem nuts to you, but that's how they take this seriously. They bring soil from Israel and fill their graves in with it in New York. I hope you noticed in Psalm 105, I don't want to gloss over this, right? What we hear in Deuteronomy as well is that you'll enjoy things you didn't build. You'll get vineyards you didn't cultivate. You'll live in houses you didn't build. And don't forget that God underlies this kind of giving. It reminds me of the speech Barack Obama gave about how we all rely on interstates. We like to say we're self-made people, but you didn't build that road. And that comes right out of the good book, right? You're driving on streets you didn't build. So don't forget that. And don't forget that connects us to one another and to God. I just think that's a lovely way, right? It really combats individualism. We're not self-made people. We labor, but we stand on the shoulders of people and policies and taxes and government works that have gone before us. For better or worse.
I have another question. Oh.
Yeah, please.
One thing when the more I'm thinking through the way the Old Testament, super ancient writings compared to New Testament, how they fit together. I wonder if you have anything to say to me to help me, but how did Jesus view these stories, especially this one of Abraham and Isaac? And I will tell you personally, when I have read, the New Testament, and he says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, then I've always read that honestly as a very exclusive, that's who I was the God of. And so I don't know where I'm going with this, but just sort of thinking through what was Jesus's view of scripture? I know it wasn't written down this way when he was, you know what I mean? When he was walking the earth. And then one thing that, in conversations with people and when I'm questioning the Old Testament and questioning, the laws and the prophets and the words that are actually there, I'm pointed to, but Jesus said, I came to fulfill those, and so I'm just curious about that relationship since yeah. So anyway, so I just had that tension of like, what was Jesus's view of how he related to the scriptures and whether or not those kind of stories pointed to him, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I want to start out by telling you Jesus was actually really liberal because the Sadducees are the most conservative branch of Judaism. I mean, there's more than like 3 or 4 denominations at the time, but the Sadducees only read the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's it. Nothing else is scripture. The Pharisees said like the Psalms and the writings are part of scripture. And it's clear Jesus was taught by a Pharisee because he goes around quoting Isaiah and the Psalms, right? So liberal for his day as to what makes it in. There's some other people like the Essenes who lived at Qumran, and they included stuff that didn't make it into the Bible. Yeah. I think what's interesting to your question, right? Like, how would Jesus have read these books? You kind of have to read the Talmud, which is like rabbinic commentary. And like one of the things we don't seem to realize is the Talmud is full of rabbis disagreeing. Our Jewish brothers and sisters have not preserved a singular tradition. They've preserved a tradition of disagreement. It's like the only thing rabbis can agree on is to come back together. Wow, I love that. I mean, I do. I love that. Because in our quest to have like one faith, we've confused uniformity with unity. And somebody asked me recently, like, how about you in the Episcopal Church? And to be honest, the Episcopal Church was founded as a key anchor that we're going to be the middle way. And the middle way means it's like a big tent, which means we're not even going to necessarily be unified in doctrine, but we are going to be unified in worship. And when you really sit on that phrase, that makes the bandwidth really wide. And that's how Jewish people do it. That's how they do it. So I think if you want to know how Jesus thought of this story, read the Talmud. You'll get a closer idea. Yeah. I want to call out a couple of other things because we read 2 weeks, and these are maybe interesting to you, and maybe they're not. You understand we get that some of this is mythology, right? Like no baby is born as hairy as a goat. Like that's a stretch, And like Edom is a nation. If you went to Jordan, we were in the nation of Edom, right? Which is like this real strong rival, spoke a Semitic language, very close to the Hebrew people, but like sometimes it's harder culturally to live when there's just a little bit of difference than when there's a wild amount of difference. And so this is like the scriptures call the Edomites down a whole bunch, and this is where it comes from. Esau means red, because if you've been to Wadi Rum, it's red, right? It's red land. And there's this trick where Jacob, Esau goes hunting and he's not successful, which tells you he's a failure, right? And he says, I want to have some of that. My Bible says like pottage, but in Hebrew it says, give me some of that red. Now, I don't know what that is. Like nobody knows, but the red guy is asking for the red. And is also this like really interesting story where Jacob is fighting before he's even born to be born first. And he spends his whole life trying to be the firstborn. He wants the birthright, he wants the blessing, but at the end of the day, you can't have that. My daughter was so disappointed when I said, you'll never be older than your brother. Because she doesn't like losing things. Well, that's the spirit of the story, right? Like you can pretend you're the firstborn, but you're not. And the story is about this guy trying to be something he can never be. And it's weird that he chooses to like fight his brother instead of saying like birth order is just what it is. I think there's a lot of spirituality wrapped up in that. We don't always notice some of these little bits here, right? there's this theme of like tricksters and swindlers in the Bible. So heel grabber means supplanter, like thief. I mean, they name their kids Harry and Thief. Like those are the boys' names, right? So by the way, if you're thinking like, hey, I'd like to name my, well, anyway, it's not that Jacob's a bad name. Just understand it means thief. Like I don't know what parent names their kid Thief, but that's what they did, right? And he comes from a line of thievery. I mean, when you read the Rebecca story, to me, it's really clear Laban wants to keep the money and not deliver the goods. Oh, let Rebecca stay a couple more days. I mean, he's not going to send her. He just wants to keep the stuff, right? And it is interesting, somebody noticed women have a little more agency. I mentioned this book to you, Rediscovering Eve, that says that is true. Until there is a bureaucracy and a monarchy, women were in control. Helpful to know, Hebrew families lived in compounds, multi-building compounds. And there's actually the mother's house that was inhabited by the matriarch. And the matriarch presided over fertility for the family. So when you read Genesis, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother. That happened. You left and you lived in the matriarch's home when you were the new husband until the patriarch died, and then you moved into that place. And Sarah does control fertility. Notice that Sarah controls who is going to be like the preferred heir. The text is really clear. Abraham had a whole bunch of other kids. They're all named, right? Happens in Genesis 26. Notice Rebecca controls the blessing. And notice the women, because we've read this part, Rachel and Leah, they control the kids and they duke it out, right? And Jacob seems really passive, right? Like somehow Rachel gets to decide who her husband has sex with. It's like she's in control of that. And then there's this weird bit, right? Like God sees that Leah's not loved and like feels sorry for her and gives her kids who Jacob doesn't love either. I guess it's just a really tragic story. I notice her own father doesn't love her. He forces her into a marriage with a man who doesn't love her because that's the cultural practice. And marriages aren't for love. And that's important to remember. Like this is not about love. This is about women being taken care of. It may be helpful for you to know that it says that Leah has weak eyes. Actually, the word actually kind of seems to mean like special or beautiful. Some interpreters will tell you her eyes were blue. Some people will say she had like astigmatism. We don't know what's going on with her eyes, but there is this interesting bit where Leah means heifer and Rachel means ewe, like E-W-E, like the sheep. And Jacob's a shepherd, so what do you know? He prefers the sheep. And I hope you read the story and you feel really sorry for Leah. I do. And what's interesting is you get to hear the history of the veil at the wedding. Dad gives her away and dad tricks the tricky guy, right? I mean, this is a story. Jacob's a jerk and steals and tricks, and Laban beats him at his own game initially. Now, in the end, Jacob's going to out-trick Laban. If you read that story, it's total garbage. You cannot put palms over sheep and make them come out spotted. I mean, this is like really weird. So this is not a literal description. It's a story of how Jacob ends up tricky. And somehow there's this like theme in Genesis that the Hebrew people are frankly like really weak. And by the way, they are. Egypt is an empire. Mesopotamia is an empire. And Canaan's a buffer zone. And so like maybe they have to rely on trickery because they don't have military technology or numbers. They don't have the Nile, which is a constant source of water, nor do they have the Tigris and Euphrates, which are a constant source of farming. So at the end of the day, there seems to be some core identity that like you get what you can by hook or crook. Do you notice that Reuben means son of my seeing, and Leah has weird eyes, and Jacob doesn't see Leah because she's wrapped up in a veil. It's all some kind of strange pun. And we don't always get it because we're not reading what the names mean. We're hearing, oh, his son's Reuben. His son means son of my seeing. And he didn't see very well because he was drunk. I don't know if you noticed, the text is like kind of not coarse, but it's punchy. There's this word in Hebrew called hine. We translate it as behold, but it means like boom shakalaka or something like that. Like it's like this like big loud surprise word. So Jacob goes to bed with his wife, and in the morning, behold, there's Leah. Boom shakalaka. Like Jacob wakes up and it's like, where did you come from? Please also notice, right, that the way marriage works in the Bible, and I want to be really clear, when you have sex with a woman, you're married. And there's all of this like evangelical talk about the beauty of marriage. And I do believe in the beauty of marriage, but it didn't work then as now. The way you got married, you had sex with a virgin and you paid her dad. That was it. I don't want to have a transaction like that with my daughter. I'm just going to be honest. John?
Yeah, was polygamy something that was accepted in the Hebrew world?
Oh yeah, definitely. Look at Abraham's got lots of wives.
And they're not just concubines, they're wives.
Yeah, it's right. And there's both kinds. Yeah, there's wives and concubines, and then there's like prostitutes.
Are there wives that are first amongst equals?
Yeah, and Sarah seems to be that lady, and Abraham decides that. I do want you to notice that there's a type scene that happens here. Anytime in the Bible you see a guy at a well, in your head you should hear the wedding bell. So servant meets Rebecca, that's the best case. Jacob meets Rachel, doesn't quite go as well. Moses meets Zipporah. And then it's really helpful to hear when Jesus meets that Samaritan woman at the well, that's like playing a pun. You should be thinking, oh, unmarried woman, like here comes the marriage of Jesus. And it turns out to be like not that. But it's a type. It's like you see the well, you hear the bell. What else do we want to say about this business? There is this theme that God chooses the least qualified, and that's so that there's no doubt that God's helping. Because if God chose really competent, equipped people, then maybe they made it on their own. That's an interesting part of the story. And we do get to hear, look, these, I mean, it's really clear. Families are still dysfunctional, but these people take the cake. I mean, really, like these, you look at the blatant favoritism that happens in these stories, you look at the Absalom story, and it's like, oh my God, like I know better than that. And the answer is hopefully we do. But these are just tough stories. Absalom, by the way, it either means the god Salim is my father, or it means my father's peace. Look at the irony of what David's peace looks like. We didn't read the story, but what happens, right, is David has a daughter called Tamar, and David has an older son who rapes the sister and hates her, which, by the way, what do you know? That's how rape works. It's not about the sex, it's about the power. The Bible nailed that. Sends her out so she has no future. She's essentially ruined, and David doesn't do anything. And for that reason, Absalom throws revolution. By the way, I'd want to do that too. If we read Absalom as the villain, what we fail to see is David is a terribly dysfunctional father and has not meted out any justice even in his own family. Yeah, these are, that's why, like some people say like, oh, I just don't like the Hebrew Bible. Man, it is true to life. Especially when you read at World War I, every monarch in Europe was related to each other. The King of England, Kaiser Wilhelm, they were like cousins. I mean, that's dysfunctional families, right? This is it. Hey, thanks for staying on board. I want to respect our time. Let's just, how about read lesson 6. We're just going to do lesson 6 for next week. And if you went to Jordan with us 2 years ago, you've been to this spot. We went to the Jabbok at sunset. I'll show you a photo of it. Yeah, we happened there by chance. It's a splendiferous photo. I mean, it's lovely. Thanks for your time. If you ever have questions, comments. Sorry?
How about chapter 5?
Oh, we read that for this week.
Oh, yeah, I read chapter 4.
Well, you were good. You were good, but we were going to double up this week. So if you want to, as always, next week we can do any remnants from 5 in addition to 6. And 6 is short. It's like 4 chapters in Genesis. So I think we'll have lots of time to do any other catch up we want to do.
Okay.
And I'm pounding this unreasonable pace because I want to finish before I go on sabbatical. I don't like dangling chads for months. So thanks for putting up with me. Thank you, everybody, for your investment of time. Grateful.